Hello again. We are going to talk about colonial Africa in war and in depression over the next several sessions. I want to begin, remember, by 1914, almost the whole of Africa had been colonized by 1900, so it's not an extended length of time that colonialism has had direct rule over Africans, but colonial rule has been established over almost all Africans by the beginning of the First World War. And I should add this just so that we're all clear. Rodney makes this point, and I want you to understand it. The basic parameters of the European-African relationship were established in the time of the slave trade. Colonialism was only the mechanism for continuing that relationship following the demise of slavery. So the basic relationship of a subordinate African population who do not have control over their economies, whose economies are ultimately controlled by one or another or all the European powers, that basic relationship was established by the 16th century with the advent of the slave trade. So although colonialism represents a new phase of that relationship remains basically the same relationship. Rodney, again, goes into this in much greater detail, and I hope that you're reading this Walter Rodney book so that you fully understand what it is that Rodney's saying here and understand this history. Although it is not widely discussed, Africa itself was one of the major causes of the First World War. During the scramble for Africa, Britain and France nearly came to blows over the northwestern portion of Africa. France was expanding west to east across Africa, across the northern central portion of Africa, and Britain was expanding from the south to the north and the north to the south. And where they intersected at a place called Fashoda, 1896, they very nearly went to war over Africa. So Africa's relation as a source of European conflict had already by 1914 been well established. But in any case, the division of Africa and in general the colonial world amongst the industrial powers was anything but equal. The British and the French, for example, each got nearly 4 million square miles of territory in Africa, whereas the Germans, as we've seen, only got 1 million square miles of territory. Moreover, the British and French were able to put vastly greater numbers under their sway. 57 million Africans lived under British rule, 36 million under French rule, but only 15 million under German rule. And really, when it comes to exploitation, when it comes to making wealth, the ultimate wealth of a colony is not so much the resources that are under the soil, but the people who are above the soil. The more people you have, the more that you have to draw in terms of making profit, wealth. It's people that make wealth. Without people, there is no such thing. You can't have wealth. As Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American scholar, in my opinion, the greatest American scholar of the 20th century. As W.E.B. Du Bois describes it then, this First World War was in the main a war about the colonial redivision of Africa and a colonial redivision of the world. The colonies of the world had been very unequally divided. The British getting the lion's share, the French in second place, even Holland, tiny Holland, getting a much larger share of the world's colonial booty than did the Germans. And so the Germans, questing after the spoils of empire, sought to redivide the colonial world. Redivide the colonial world in a period of time when there were no new territories available for colonizing. The Germans sought to redivide the existing colonial world to the advantage of Germany and to the advantage of gaining the greater spoils of colonialism. Writing less than a year after the war broke out, W.E.B. Du Bois described the origin of the war. And he did this in an article titled "The African Roots of the War," which if I'm not mistaken, I think I assigned that to you. Here's Du Bois. Here's what Du Bois said. The present world war is, then, the result of jealousies engendered by the recent rise of armed national associations of labor and capital, whose aim is the exploitation of the wealth of the world, mainly outside the European circle of nations. So again, as I said in quoting Cecil Rhodes, remember several sessions back, I quoted Cecil Rhodes about visiting a meeting of the working class people of East London. And Rhodes says that the solution to the internal problems of Great Britain, the warfare that potentially existed between the upper class and the lower classes in Britain, the solution to that potential civil war, that's how Rhodes described it. The solution was empire. And here Du Bois is saying something similar. The rise of armed national associations of labor and capital. The working people and the well-to-do people united as a nation in a colonial empire project, a project of creating colonial empire. These associations, grown jealous and suspicious at the division of the spoils of trade empire, are fighting to enlarge their respective shares. They look for expansion, not in Europe, but in Asia, and particularly in Africa. We want no inch of French territory, said Germany to England. But Germany was, quote, unable to give similar assurances as to France in Africa. Du Bois is saying here that what the Germans are questing after is the portions of the French Empire in Africa. Writing shortly after the war, Du Bois again looked at this situation. And here in language which is so beautiful and graphic, he says this: Germany looked across the seas, and seeing England with sources of wealth, ensuring a luxury and power which Germany could not hope to rival by the slower processes of exploiting her own peasants and working men, especially with these workers half in revolt, immediately built her navy and entered into a desperate competition for possession of colonies of darker peoples. So again, the basic theory that I outlined several sessions back that the Europeans are following. The source of wealth at home is empire abroad. The Germans cannot build up their wealth simply by exploiting their own working people. And Du Bois adds that these working people are in revolt against the exploitation that they are currently suffering. So the answer to German problems, the internal problems of Germany, the war between the rich and the poor in Germany, is empire, is colonial expansion. To South America, you've got to love this guy. You've got to love this guy. You've got to read this stuff. You've got to print off the PowerPoint slides, read this stuff with your own eyes, then go find it in a library. To South America, to China, to Africa, to Asia Minor, she, Germany, turned like a hound, quivering on the leash, impatient, suspicious, irritable, with bloodshot eyes and dripping fangs. England and France, also dogs, crouched watchfully over their bones, growling and wary, but gnawing industriously, while the blood of the dark world whetted their greedy appetites. So the dogs, which have the biggest colonial empire, see this angry German dog approaching, and they eye that German dog warily, but they keep on eating. It was this competition for the labor of yellow, brown, and black folks that was cause of the World War, says Du Bois. Other causes have been glibly given, and other contributing causes there doubtless were, but they were subsidiary and subordinate to this vast quest of the dark world's wealth and toil. It was a fight to redivide the colonial empires of the world that was the cause of the First World War. Oftentimes we are given a victor's perspective of the First World War, in which the Germans are the war makers and the aggressors, and certainly to some extent that there's truth to that. But the other side of that story is what? Is that the Germans are simply looking to get a larger share of the theft already committed by the British and the French. And if we're going to condemn the Germans, if we're going to make a moral judgment about the Germans, let's also make that same moral judgment about the British and the French. I think with that, I'll conclude this little segment, and we will move into a discussion of Africa during the First World War in our next.